Okay, welcome back to part two of part one of chapter four. But yeah, I'll just call this part two of the week four lecture. The numbers are getting a bit confusing, but just to pick up where I left off in the previous segment, again, just have a sense that this is kind of how Marxist criticism gets done. Not all Marxist critics have to accept all aspects of Marxism. And in fact, Gramsci and a lot of others criticized Marx in certain areas. They would point out some of the ways in which he was wrong, or some of the ways that he may have, sort of misunderstood or put too much emphasis on certain things, whatever. And they revised some of his ideas to fit, their circumstances. So just a quick rundown of some important names. I'm going to come back to a couple of these guys. Raymond Williams is an important cultural materialist. I would classify him as more of a cultural materialist, not necessarily a strictly Marxist critic, although, yeah, he borrows a lot from Marxism. He's very influenced by Gramsci, and he's very influenced by Gramsci's concept of hegemony. So like many of these others, Williams felt like culture did play a large role in the enforcement of the ruling class's hegemony. However, Williams himself came from a working class background in Wales. He was an interesting guy, and he spent much of his life teaching adult education to sort of blue-collar working class people. So, based at least in part on his own background, he argued that the working classes really kind of had their own culture. And yeah, he agreed that the ruling classes used a lot of popular culture, or even like what we might think of as high art, the classics, great works of art from previous centuries. Yeah, he admitted that the ruling classes, used those as weapons to enforce their ideology or their hegemony. But he also pointed out that working classes develop different cultures, and they're not always completely beholden to the ruling class's culture. So Williams, coming from that working class background himself, he speaks from kind of personal experience and says, hey, we kind of have our own poetry. We have our own stories. We have our own art. So yeah, the ruling classes have more power, but he theorized that the cultures of working classes could create their own types of hegemony, and maybe in time they could rise up and challenge the culture of the ruling classes. So Williams is not calling for like an armed rebellion, but he is kind of hoping for a sort of cultural rebellion where the working class cultures can maybe exist side by side, or maybe just displace the traditional ruling class cultures. So we'll come back to Williams a little bit. They also mentioned Terry Eagleton in the chapter. He's a very important English Marxist critic. I'll come back to him as well. Pierre Bourdieu is kind of important to remember just for this one key concept that he gives us, the idea of cultural capital. And we've already kind of covered this, but he kind of articulates it better than anybody had previously. It's this idea that the ruling class seems to provide a lot of aesthetic choices to us when it comes to regular people, the masses, which, can probably be considered to include middle class people, working class people, lower class people might be considered in a separate category. I don't know. But if you want to sort of generalize and talk about everybody who's not an owner, everybody who's not rich, then that would include the middle class, the working class, and the lower classes. But there's this idea that the ruling class gives the rest of us options, or at least they seem to. They give us a lot of different movies to watch. They give us a lot of different books that we can read, a lot of different shows on TV, and it goes beyond just cultural production. They give us a lot of restaurants to eat at, right? We have options when it comes to entertainment and culture. But the whole idea with Bourdieu, what he says is, yeah, but that's just a fiction. There's not really choices. Those are all choices, but they're all choices dictated by the ruling class. So they want you to think that you're free to choose, but really you're just choosing between several options that they've already authorized and sanctioned and sort of approved for you. you should think about advertising a little bit too when you think about some of these ideas, the ways that these guys think that the ruling class is kind of dominating everybody else. Well, in more modern times, and even back then, I mean, advertising has been important for quite some time, but I would argue now maybe even more than ever because there's so many more avenues. So even stuff today like social media, advertising, along with television, movies, popular literature, music, we could argue that these are all cultural. These are all aspects of culture, and they can all be wielded as weapons to maybe keep us distracted and keep us away from the things that really matter. Again, you don't have to believe that or accept that as true, but that's still an idea that a lot of thinkers are playing with even today. And Bourdieu kind of contributes to that with this idea of cultural capital. And again, the ruling classes have all the capital. That means money and that means cultural capital. And then there's also Frederick Jameson, who's a famous American Marxist critic. And again, if you pursue English study at the graduate level, you'll have to read Jameson. He's important for us because he criticizes the formalists. And he's really opposed to their whole strategy for separating art from history and politics. We remember all about the formalists from last week. So again, Jameson's typical of more recent, I mean, he was around like in the 50s, 60s, 70s. Well, maybe he wasn't quite that old, but certainly 60s, 70s. He's tapping in, again, to this sort of general left-leaning approach that's, encouraging us to, in his own words, sort of, he wants a return of the repressed in literary text. He wants literature to reveal social conflicts. Again, kind of going back to those New York intellectuals that predate him by a few decades, there's this general idea that if we want to understand modern literature, we need to understand class, like social class. We need to understand money and how money gets made. And we need to understand all the origins of these social divisions, these social sort of disjunctions. And they thought a lot of that kind of boiled down to economics. They weren't economists themselves, but they said, hey, we have to at least pay some attention to some of these factors. And for Jameson, yeah, it's important to uncover some of those social conflicts. And he considered politics, history, and what he just considered society in general to be the three potential horizons of a text. So what does that mean? Well, those are the three sort of general places a text might take you, or three places that a text could potentially shed light on. So this kind of gets us back to some of those pre-critical approaches that I was talking about back in week 2. Remember the historical approach, the moral approach, the biographical approach. So in some ways, Jameson's kind of calling for a little bit of a return to some of those. As I told you before, a lot of that stuff, it fell out of fashion and then it came back again. And we'll see that again next week when we talk about new historicism. And Jameson's kind of a champion of the new historicism. Again, these categories of critical approaches are kind of loose, and sometimes things bleed across. But new historicism is kind of it's a new version of the old historicism that was considered a pre-critical approach. So like those pre-critical scholars and critics, what Jameson is calling for is a return to these larger contexts, these social contexts, these historical concerns. But for him, it's history, it's politics, and it's society. Those are always going to factor into literary analysis. So he's very much opposed to the formalist way of doing things, and that, of course, gets us ready for the cultural materialists. So this is a very broadly, sort of loosely defined school or approach, and I want us to think about the materialists, the cultural materialists, as just in general sort of a left-leaning liberal approach that largely rose up in Great Britain between the 1950s and the 1980s, and it was largely defined in opposition to formalism. And the formalist type approaches that had risen in prominence, like we said last time, around like the 1930s into the 40s. So even once World War II ends in 45, formalism and related approaches are still kind of the dominant method of literary study. So we talked about reader response last time and how that began to rise up in the 50s as a response and an alternative to formalism. Well, you should think of cultural materialism as another potential alternative to the formalist approach. So cultural materialists were very opposed to this sort of anti-history, this ahistorical, this apolitical approach to literature. And they found it very elitist. And we kind of touched on this when we were talking about formalism last week. This idea that there was sort of a strain of elitism to that whole approach. Because the whole idea is you kind of had to be trained to be able to undertake it. They didn't care about readers. They didn't care about emotions. They didn't care about history or the author's life or any of that stuff. They were taking that sort of pseudo-scientific, very rigorous approach to the text itself, the text alone, divorced from all other concerns. And for the cultural materialist, that just didn't make a lot of sense, because for them, literature is largely valuable for what it can sort of teach us about culture writ large, about class distinctions, about social formations. So for them, why would we ignore history and politics and social conditions? Why would we ignore that? We need to understand all of that in order to understand the text itself. So they really break from formalism, just like the reader response approach did. And beginning in the 50s, in England, we have sort of the origins of what would later be called cultural materialism. This kind of starts with F.R. Leavis and some other guys who were like scholars and teachers and writers in that period. And there was a big push in in England after World War II, in like the post-war in the post-war years. There was a real push to kind of bring what was previously thought to be like high art or high culture, the classics, kind of bringing that stuff to the masses, sort of democratizing art, making it more accessible, democratizing culture in many ways, making it more accessible to everybody, not just the elites, not just the ruling classes with the money and the power and the ownership of everything. So this is kind of a real push that begins, like I said, right after World War II, and it kind of leads to more developments in cultural materialism. So there's this idea that we can just make the country better if we sort of share a culture. If all members of society are exposed to Shakespeare or Jane Austen or Milton, these sort of canonical figures in English art and culture, let's give access to that to everybody. Again, prior to World War II, that wouldn't have necessarily been a priority for a lot of people. But there's this idea that let's make it for everyone. So that kind of gets the ball rolling, and then later materialists like Stuart Hall will agree with the earlier Marxists and say, yeah, sure, a lot of popular culture, a lot of the mass media that we see, a lot of popular entertainment is used by the ruling classes to sort of enforce their ideology or their hegemony, just like the Marxists were saying. But Hall takes it a step further and he says, yeah, but what's interesting, this is similar to what Raymond Williams was saying, Hall points out that there isn't just one culture. There is the ruling class culture, yeah, and it gets enforced and communicated in all these different ways, but there are other cultures too. So like Williams, Hall is kind of attuned to working class cultures. Cultures that don't have the power, that don't have the visibility that the ruling class culture has, but they still exist. They kind of exist on lower levels or sort of different registers, but they're there. And they have their own traditions. They have their own literature and perhaps their own artistic and literary productions. So Hall makes the point that maybe, again, kind of like Williams, looking ahead, maybe in time, we'll be able to appreciate many different cultures instead of trying to bring everybody under the heading of one culture, which is kind of what Levis and a lot of those other guys wanted to do when they wanted to bring the classics to the working class. People like Williams and Hall, they weren't totally opposed to that. They liked a lot of the classics too, but they were a little bit more interested in discovering other cultures, alternative cultures, and maybe celebrating all the cultures and maybe, again, democratizing things so all the cultures can kind of coexist on more equal footing. Hall also made an interesting observation about the art of the ruling classes, and he was like, yeah, sure, they're enforcing their hegemony through these art forms, but the individual viewer or reader has the freedom to interpret the art of the ruling class in whatever way he or she wants. So, yeah, I can go and watch an action movie put out by Hollywood, which would kind of qualify for these guys as a type of art that's really being used by the ruling class to kind of enforce their worldview. Maybe that movie is encouraging me to buy stuff or to focus on love and relationships and not the fact that I'm being ripped off by my boss or whatever. But the idea is, even if that's all true, and the movie is really just a vehicle for the ruling class's ideology, I might not take it that way. I'm an individual, kind of like the reader response idea. Every individual is going to interpret a text differently, at least a little bit differently, based on my own personality, my own views. So if I don't accept the message that's being sort of delivered to me, that's a form of freedom, according to Hall. That's a way to kind of escape the hegemony. Yeah, the movie's designed to deliver the hegemony, but I could interpret it a different way. It can mean something different to me as the individual viewer or reader. So that's kind of an interesting concept to consider as well. So I just want to wrap up by going back to Williams and Eagleton. These are just two guys that I worked with a good bit in grad school. I'm kind of fond of both of them. Williams in particular is a very interesting figure to me. I had to read about him a little bit. Like I said, he was Welsh. He was from this sort of like rural village. I believe his father was like a stonemason or something. A lot of his relatives were farmers. So he was really interested in what was happening to what he viewed as a sort of alternative culture. Because, yeah, he subscribed to the basic Marxist notion that you had this ruling class that was imposing their culture on everybody else. But what he wanted to point out was that where he was from, this rural area of Wales, it was almost a pre-modern culture. They were so far removed from factories and industrialization and these other aspects of modern society that they kind of had their own thing. They had their own, again, their own art, their own songs, their own traditions, their own ways of life that were separate from what we might, consider the ruling class. But that was changing because of rapid, development, and cities were spreading. The suburbs were reaching out into the countryside. So a lot of his relatives and the people that he knew, they were losing their land. They were forced to leave their old way of life. So this was interesting to him and, of course, tragic. But for him, just like with Hall, he was interested in sort of, again, discovering these other kinds of cultures. He found what he called sort of oppositional or residual cultures that didn't quite fit into these neat categories of ruling class and proletariat. Because again, Marx was largely thinking about factory workers, sort of laborers in the cities, in urban areas. But Williams is thinking more about sort of an agrarian life, a pastoral life, a rural life, defined by a real close connection to the land and, agriculture. So for him, there's, again, sort of a pre-modern culture that really harkens back to, like, the Middle Ages that's still hanging on in some of these rural areas. Of course, it's threatened by industry and rapid sort of suburbanization. But there's sort of older cultures. There's new emerging cultures that are coming up that people might not know about yet. And there are these oppositional cultures that are, sort of defining themselves in opposition maybe to the dominant culture, the ruling class's culture. So Williams is an interesting guy. again, like I mentioned, he taught adults for much of his life. So he kind of used his own experiences and the experiences of his students, these working class adults who didn't have the money to go to elite, colleges and universities. He used all of that to sort of theorize about a working class identity and a working class culture. But like a lot of other materialists, he was interested in the ways that these different cultures can appropriate certain texts, like canonical texts, Shakespeare, Milton, Jane Austen. Oftentimes the ruling class would use those to accomplish whatever they wanted with the proletariat, but in some cases, when other cultures, like when working class cultures, got their hands on those same texts, the effects could be different. Because they wouldn't be using them to oppress other people, they would be using them to empower themselves or to discover things about themselves or to oppose the ruling class in various ways. So I like Williams, just personally, but I want to finish with Eagleton because he actually takes us back to something that we were discussing in week 1. And it's pretty interesting to kind of reflect back on it. So Eagleton and a lot of the cultural materialists, like Williams, were very interested in the increasing secularization of Western society. And what does that mean? Okay, well, the societies were becoming secular. That means they were becoming less religious. That doesn't mean that individuals within the societies were not religious. It just meant that the governments were no longer connected to the church like they had been in, olden times. We no longer had kings who had the divine right to rule. Now we had democratically elected governments in most of Western Europe and, of course, the U.S. This is like part of the post-war order. This is post-World War II. This is kind of the construction of what we still kind of think of as like the modern Western world order, with the U.S. and some of our allies like the Brits and the French kind of on top. And now Germany's kind of there with us, even though they were, of course, on the wrong side of World War II, but they reformed. But anyway, we have this increasing secularization. So what does that matter? That means literature matters more. And this is a theory that Eagleton and Williams and a lot of these guys played around with, and they don't really cover it very much in the book. I just wanted to add it on because I personally think it's cool, but it's also connected to the beginnings of English as an academic discipline in higher education, something that we mentioned back in week 1. But what Eagleton really tries to explain in a lot of his writing is that in the post-war world, sure, people still go to church, people still pray, but overall, Western societies are a lot less religious than they used to be. And religious institutions used to be the best way to deliver what he calls moral ideology, which is basically what we've been talking about. It's just part of the hegemony. It's part of what the ruling class is using to maintain things as they are. But again, traditionally, this is a real moral bent that should make us think about the moral approach to literature that we talked about in week 2. So like Eagleton and a lot of these other English guys point out, like the moral value of literature was a very English thing. And not everybody else cared if their literature delivered moral messages, but the Brits cared. And they cared for a long time. So as religion fades a little bit from everyday life, they need another vehicle, another mechanism to deliver moral instruction or moral ideology to make everybody act right and fall in line. So what can replace religion as that great vehicle for communicating moral ideology? Culture writ large is the answer, but more specifically, literature. So let me just read you a little bit of an article, or actually a book that Eagleton wrote like back in the 80s. I will not share much of it, just a little bit. So he gets back to talking about English and the origins of English being taught in higher ed. And he's saying, look, at the beginning, at least here in England, and this is, America has a slightly different history, but we'll just stick with England for now. At the beginning, English was not, as a discipline, it was not being taught at the elite institutions. It was being taught at what he calls mechanics institutes, working men's colleges, kind of like what we would think of as vocational schools or technical colleges or community colleges. And also the extension lecturing circuits. He goes on to say, English was literally the poor man's classics, a way of providing a cheap liberal arts education for those beyond the charmed circles of the elite. So in other words, for those who were not in the ruling classes, for those who were not the owners, that were not the bourgeoisie. So again, for a long time in Western history, education and the arts were reserved for the wealthy and the powerful. But that's changing in this rapidly modernizing world that these guys are sort of in and commenting on. So Eagleton's saying at the beginning, English was taught it was really delivered as a means of providing a liberal arts education for working class people. And then he goes on and says, and this was of course what the ruling class wanted because, well, he'll tell you why. They wanted to teach English in that way to those students in particular, so they could encourage more solidarity among the classes. So they could, sort of prevent Marx's prediction of a class war from ever coming true. So they could cultivate larger sympathies and empathies amongst people, different kinds of people. So they could install national pride. Now, of course, the Brits were on the winning side of World War II, but if you guys know much about that history, you know that their country was somewhat devastated by the war. It's hard for Americans to appreciate this, but, we didn't get bombed by the Nazis. The Brits did a lot. So they were kind of in the doldrums for a few years after the war, even though they were on the winning side. And most importantly, a big reason why English was being taught was for the transmission of moral values. So again, going back to the moral approach to literature, this was a long tradition in England. But it becomes important to do it at the college level because religion is fading. So we need literature to serve the role that religion previously served, and that means delivering moral ideology to everybody. So everybody's on the same page and everybody is falling in line. So I'll just jump ahead a little bit. So here's the larger point that he's making. In the sort of modern world that's emerging here in the 1940s and 50s, morality is no longer to be grasped as a formulated code or explicit ethical system. That's how morality had previously been understood. But now, in the modern world, it becomes what he calls a sensitive preoccupation with the whole quality of life itself. That's pretty vague. But also the nuanced particulars of human experience. He goes on, somewhat rephrased, this can be taken as meaning that the old religious ideologies have lost their force, and that a more subtle communication of moral values is now in order. And since such values are nowhere more vividly dramatized than in literature, it is literature that can now be more than just a handmaiden or a vehicle for moral ideology. It becomes the moral ideology in the modern age, according to Eagleton. Literature is the moral ideology for a sort of more secular, modern world. So, that's kind of what I want to leave with today, or stop with. And I don't know if that makes a lot of sense to you, but it's just this idea that from the very beginnings, at least in Great Britain, the whole kind of reason English was taught was to kind of empower and assist working class people. There was kind of a socialist, left-leaning sort of approach here at work politically. But there was also this sense that it was still the old hegemony that the earlier Marxists had talked about. This was still the ruling class trying to impose a moral ideology on everybody else. And before they would use religion primarily to do that. Now they're going to use literature, but and other forms of culture. But it just depends on how you want to look at it. So within this basic sort of platform, you can choose to be relatively pessimistic and say, well, any attempt to teach these working class people, it might seem good, but it's just another way that the ruling class is screwing us and making us accept their way of doing things. But you can also take more of the Raymond Williams approach and say that might be true to an extent, but these working class people are creating culture of their own. And like Stuart Hall points out, individuals can interpret the art or the culture of the ruling classes in whatever way they want. So there are ways to maybe break free from the hegemony. But what Eagleton and Williams and a lot of these materialists and Marxists are showing us is that the very discipline of English is kind of wrapped up in all of this. Whether you agree with Marxism or not, these are kind of foundational issues to the whole discipline. And these basic social divisions, I think, remain between the owners and the workers. So the questions that we have to ask ourselves now are, do we have a culture or a national literature in this country that can speak to both classes, the rulers and the workers? Or do we have separate cultures for separate classes? And is that okay? How do we navigate all of this today? But just remember, Marxism is just another set of tools. Cultural materialism is an offshoot of Marxism, but it's a bit separate. These are just sets of tools that we can use when we're doing literary analysis. Okay, I'll stop there. If you have questions, let me know, and I'll see you next week when we cover the second half of Chapter 4.